Hello everyone, and welcome to Spirit of Truth Church, Spirit of Truth Outreach, for this edition of Apology Accepted, where we are going to examine the archaeology of the biblical times with specific reference to the flood, to the time of the Patriarchs. So we're not going to include Patriarchs time, we're just going to do flood to the Patriarchs. I think you guys are going to have a really great time. There's a lot of very cool stuff that we have about the flood and some of the related topics. So with that, let's jump right in. Now, first, there are many who would say, well, the flood is just a myth, or the flood never happened, or, there's no evidence of a worldwide flood or a regional flood, or whatever take you take on it, that, there's just no evidence of a flood. Okay? Here's the interesting thing, though, is that people often said, well, the flood's just in the Bible. This would be one of the comments. It's just in the Bible. It's just a myth. Well, the funny thing is that the flood story was known throughout the Fertile Crescent. All pagan histories that we have recorded from antiquity have some account or telling of the flood story, of a Noah-like figure, of a punishment from the gods, and of a, essentially, restoration of humankind. That is huge. That this seems to be part of the collective fabric of every ancient civilization. This detailed understanding of the flood goes a long way from a secular perspective of demonstrating that this is a real event that happened. Now, obviously, I hold, due to inerrancy and due to divine revelation, I hold to the scriptures' account of this. But what I'm simply saying is, it's really exciting that there is some account of the flood story in virtually every other ancient civilization. That is huge, because that seems to indicate, again, from a natural perspective, that this flood story is rooted in history. We can see that it's rooted in history because every civilization talks about it. Now, there was an archetypal, so again, this is nearly as universal as you're going to get. It's as nearly as universal as one could hope for in terms of world history, that this flood story is present. And arguably, this flood story should be taught in every single world history course. Period, end of story. Because it was that important in antiquity. It was that much of the fabric of people's beliefs. Again, the archetypal account originated in Mesopotamia. So we've got this Mesopotamia region, Fertile Crescent region, cradle of civilization, and the flood story goes all the way back to there. Now, we talked about last time the Sumerian kings list, and again, there's mention of the flood in that list. There's the antediluvian or pre-flood kings, and there's the post-diluvian or post-flood kings. So even the flood's even mentioned on that kings list, and it was just understood, or it was assumed, that people had a universal understanding and knowledge of the flood. And I like this quote. It was, quote, believed so firmly in the former historical occurrence of such a flood that they inserted it into this king's list without any real need to explain it. It was just understood that this happened. People accepted it. They believed it. They for them, it was history. This was real history for them. It was near history in some of these cases. So again, this flood story is part of their fabric. Now, interestingly enough, it wasn't just a random flood either. And this is another piece of the puzzle of the flood. It was not just random. It was not, there was this great flood and a lot of bad things happened. No. The flood in these stories was linked to the rulership. In other words, people believed that it was poor rulership that brought about this flood. In other words, it was a judgment, and now in their case, pagan world, of the gods. But there is this divine judgment even associated with this flood that I think is very worth considering. Okay? Additionally, it talks about in a lot of these how after the flood, kingship was again lowered from heaven. In other words, there's this argument that the flood was a judgment for something. And that it's after that humanity is then restored. And so there's this interesting piece to this where kingship has to be lowered. Again, divine deliverance through the flood of some humans, and then the restoration of civilization. Additionally, we can also see that there's a complete changing of cities. The cities that existed before the flood are not the ones that exist after. There's a major interruption of civilization pre and post flood. And that plays out heavily in the archaeological record. So with this understanding, it seems the flood probably happened between 2900 and 2800 BC, which is right in the ballpark of the biblical chronology. Now, and that's, again, given by the archaeological record. The archaeological record would say probably between 2900 and 2800 BC, lines right up with Scripture. Now, here we go. This is problematic with conventional, or what we'll call the mainstream secular geological and archaeological timetable. So, we have to understand that a lot of people are going to be arguing for a non-biblical time date of the flood due to geology and things of that nature. But from the archaeological record, from these kings lists and stuff like that, it seems like it's right in line with what Scripture says, 2900 to 2800 BC. Now, one of the best accounts, and we're going to do a couple of these, is from the Urdu Genesis, okay, or the first Genesis, essentially. First peoples, first city. Eridu is city, so it's the first city, first peoples. Okay. And what's going to happen is kingship is going to come down from heaven, and Enlil and An, who are gods, are determined to wipe out mankind with a flood. And there's this man, Zuisudra, a Sumerian king priest, is going to be warned by Enki and is going to essentially makes a boat to escape the flood. So there's this judgment from the gods. There is an attempt to thwart that in some way, or attempt to avert that for a small select group of people or individual person. A boat of some kind is involved, and there's an escape from the flood, and there's even like a restoration of Eden to this kind of thing. Now, another account is the cuneiform tablets, or the Ark tablets from the Old Babylonian account. And interestingly enough, the person in that scenario who was told to build the boat, it was told to draw a boat that you'll make on a circular plan. So the boat was kind of this round thing. It was 230 feet long with walls 20 feet high. Animals were brought on 2 by 2 in this account. And again, it's another Enki account. So it's that Babylonian gods and Babylonian figures is essentially what's going on with this one. Okay, then you have the Gilgamesh epic. And the Gilgamesh epic is from about 2600 BC-ish, is sort of a history. It's borrowed from the Atrahasis account, and it mentions a sole survivor of the flood and his wife, Utnapishtim and his wife. And they were given immortality as a result of this being delivered to the flood. There was a command to build a boat that looked like a cube, 120 cubits squared. There was a command to use pitch and tar and oil and to bring treasures and all kinds of animals onto this. Okay, so you're probably seeing some similarities to the Genesis account already. There was a storm that lasted 7 days. On the 12th day it dried up. And then the person who was in charge sent out a dove, a swallow, and a raven. And when the raven didn't return, he left the boat and offered a sacrifice to gods. So let's go ahead and read some of the more of the similarities of this Epic of Gilgamesh account. So, similarities. There was a ship built. Bitumen was used on the ship, so confirmation of shipcraft or shipworking at the time. Food was stored on the ship. Animals were put onto the ship. The family of this group was on the ship. The waters covered the mountains. That's a comment in both, that waters covered the mountains. The ship had a window so they could see out. Birds were sent out. There was an altar used in sacrifice. God was pleased with the altar sacrifice. Both boats land on a mountain. Both utilize a raven as the final bird. So there is way too many similarities. Way too many similarities in this that this isn't historical. There's no question that this is looking very historical. What are some of the differences? Well, again, you're going to see more sensationalist things in the Babylonian / Epic of Gilgamesh. Multiple gods made the flood with a black cloud. The gods had a counselor. There was a Noahic figure. It wasn't Noah. It was Utnapishtim, who was instructed to leave gods. The ark was cube-shaped, not a barge-shaped like in the biblical account. The ark launched and moved into position. It wasn't lifted. Workmen brought in the ark in that case. There were 7 decks, not 3, and the interior is divided into 9 parts. So Utnapishtim closes the ark door versus God closing the ark door. The gods helped with the removal, prep food, and frightened battle occurred. The storm was 6 days and 7 nights versus 40 days and 40 nights, and we'll talk about this. And the mountain they landed on was Mount Nemush, or Nisir, versus the mountain of Ararat as the landing place. And then again, it was a raven versus a raven and a dove. Those are some other differences. So there are some differences, but the similarities are striking. Now you might be wondering, well, why the difference in the mountain? Why the difference in the days? Things like that. Well, we have to remember that in these cultures, they were going to try to make it, again, more relatable to the people, make it stories for the people. And so in the Babylonian account, they chose a mountain that was going to be closer to home, that would be more well known by people, as opposed to Mount Ararat. So you see this in some of these stories, where the mountain changes typically closer to where these stories were being passed on. So that's a common thing. Additionally, the relegation of the flood to 6 days and 7 nights, or a shorter time frame. A lot of them have this shorter time frame. And I think a big part of that is just simply, again, for storytelling purposes, 6 days, 7 nights, it just works in with their mythology maybe better. Things like that. So there's a couple of reasons why people would offer that. But again, not too big of a deal. Not too big of a deal. The point is there's a lot of similarities between all of these events. Then we have the Atrahasis account. Okay? And in that one, there's lots of similarities. So let's go through that. Similarity. People multiply and cause trouble. That's the Atrahasis account. In Genesis, the wickedness of people brings judgment. So again, notice the similarity there, that it's judgment. This is not a random flood. This was assumed to be the result of some divine work. Again, in the Atrahasis account, the flood was sent to destroy mankind. Same in Genesis. Flood is going to wipe people out. In the Atrahasis account, one man, Atrahasis, was warned of the flood. Noah was warned of the flood. The thought is this is simply the same person. He's just being given a different name in different civilizations or cultures. Again, they're both instructed to build boats. They're both instructed to fill them with animals and food. And essentially that person's saved while the world is flooded out and perishes. After the departure from the vessel, they make an altar or an offering. That happens to both. And the offering is accepted. And in the Noah account, God makes a covenant with mankind here. And the gods in Atrahasis will let mankind continue to live. So very, 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 very similar accounts that we have here. And that's really important because we would expect to see something like that. Very close, but not exact, if this truly were the origins of humanity. Now, Berosus, essentially, and this is another kind of key one, was a Babylonian court astrologer under the Seleucid ruler Antiochus I. And he had access to these ancient Babylonian records. And essentially, he's one of these kind of guys who's looking at this issue of these stories. Okay? And specifically, what's going to be taking place is people are trying to figure out, well, what is this actual mountain? What is Ararat? Is it Urartu? Is that Ararat? Where is this mountain? And the thought is that the mountain actually is indeed Mount Ararat in modern-day Turkey. Now, I'm going to go ahead and show a very quick picture of this. So give me 1 second to do that. All right, and what we're going to do is we're going to take this, I'm going to move it over here. There we go. All right, and that looks to be Mount Ararat. This, by the way, is from the Zondervan Handbook of Biblical Archaeology, giving credit where credit's due. And that's essentially Mount Ararat in Turkey. That's where people think it is. And again, the reason is they've even found stuff. I mean, it's interesting. There's stories from people saying, oh, yeah, we found stuff up here. I mean, it's very interesting. Nothing's been definitively claimed at this point. But there are stories of it up there. And people have found these mountains like, essentially petrified wood and pitch or bitumen, stuff like that, which indicates, again, potentially shipcraft, that kind of stuff. So there have been some finds that are very interesting, nothing definitive. But you wouldn't expect there to be. Thousands of years later like this, 5,000 years later, you wouldn't necessarily expect much to be left. So again, where did these stories come from? Well, the assumption is they're biblical historicity. The assumption is divine revelation, either divine revelation given directly to Moses, or Moses and the people of Israel kept these stories, and then divine revelation ensured their truthfulness in the writing down of them in the time of Moses, when he wrote the first 5 books of Scripture. Other religions and cultures essentially morph them for their own reasons, as can be very easily seen. But again, it's a real event. There's no question about it. All of this indicates this is a real event. And again, divine revelation to Moses, or at least inspiration to Moses, guarantees us that is the authentic account, the most true or historical account. And again, also the Israelite account is also more simple. It's more believable. It has a historical feel to it even. which is also kind of cool. Again, it feels very real. It's not sensationalist. Okay? And so what we can see again is this situation where, yet again, archaeology, finding these things from other civilizations, simply confirms and goes along with the biblical narrative, which is really cool. So let's talk a little bit about the construction of the ark. So the construction of the ark found in Genesis 6:13 through 16. You have the Hebrew word of teba, which is container, used as a vessel. And also, interesting enough, this was the word used of Moses' woven papyrus basket. It was a vessel. And essentially, they used bitumen to make it watertight. Now, this is really important because when they discover some of these things, the petrified wood, they find bitumen on it, they find pitch and stuff like that. Again, it's used to make it watertight. Why would you need something watertight on the side of a mountain? Well, if there was a flood and you essentially had to survive it, then you would need water tightness. Okay. Again, there's a similar design from other accounts, but there's also differences. And the thought about that is this. Why are some circular, some boat-shaped, some cube-shaped? Well, it's thought that the people changed the stories in these other civilizations to reflect the boat craft of that time. That's sort of the thought. I think that's generally probably true. Again, Israel keeping it as stated due to divine revelation. Now, what about the landing of the ark? Well, the Epic of Gilgamesh states the ark came to rest on Mount Nasir in Kurdistan. Okay. Now, again, reasons for that, well, there might be a reason to make the mountain closer to essentially where they're at. But Ararat, or Hebrew RT, essentially designates a region of eastern Turkey. Now, what's fascinating is this. We have this thing called the Old Babylonian World Map, and I'll go ahead and pull up another picture of this. And essentially, this thing is absolutely wild. Because what this shows us, this is the oldest map. Here it is. This is the oldest map we have. It's the ancient Babylonian world map. And I believe, if I'm reading this correctly, at the top is this mountain from which all people came. So it even has here in the Babylonian world map, there's this understanding that people came from a mountain. And the thought is this is Mount Ararat. This is the mountain from which people came. It's very interesting stuff. Very, very interesting stuff. And so you even have that in there. And there's actually, and I want to say his name here. I'll get this for us here in a second. I think his name was, let's see here, give me 1 second. Finkel, the assistant keeper of ancient Mesopotamian scripts, languages, and cultures at the British Museum, basically said the oldest map in the world, which is this Babylonian world map, tells us now where the ark landed after the flood. And so he was convinced. He's like, no, this is it. This is essentially showing us that this is the place. So there's a good chance we know which mountain it was. There's a good chance we know where it was. And if anything, we have ancient archaeological attestation that they made maps with the ark on it and with Mount Ararat on it, which is pretty cool. So again, it fits the Babylonian world map, and there's evidence of people living near it as late as the late Chalcolithic age. So in other words, you've got people even living there in very ancient times. You've got people living there, which is another key thing. You'd have to have some civilization there early on. And again, deviations can be explained by a desire to have something closer to home. But Mount Ararat is the only place in the past century where there's eyewitness claims to wooden structure ever have been made. So also very cool. So again, we've got this neat stuff surrounding the Babylonian world map and the ark and the flood. So what about going forward a little bit? Well, if you remember, there's the Tower of Babel and this guy called Nimrod. If you remember Nimrod, who was the great hunter. Okay, Nimrod was the great hunter. And there's a question, well, who is this Nimrod? Is he really a real person, or what's going on here? And it seems as though Nimrod might very well be the founder of the Assyrian Empire. Okay, many of the ancient cities in the Genesis account have actually been found, which is kind of cool as well. And it's possibly he's a human Mesopotamian ruler of the 3rd millennium BC. But people are now starting to say that he's most likely Sargon the Great. And here's why. Okay. Again, there's an identification of Nimrod's genealogical origin in Cush with Sargon's geographical origin in Sumerian Kish. Okay. Nimrod and Sargon were both credited with bringing Akkad into prominence. They were both involved in the initial building projects. They were known as the Great Builder in Assyria. They had a lasting influence on Assyria, and both Nimrod and Sargon were legendary for their military exploits. So you have this interesting scenario where Sargon and Nimrod share a lot. And if you want to see, we actually have a bronze bust of Sargon, who could very well be the biblical Nimrod. And there it is. Very cool stuff. So that's thought to be a bust of Nimrod, Sargon the First. All right. So continuing on, let's now talk about the Tower of Babel. So this is a fun one. It's thought to be in the general vicinity of Shinar. Migdal is the term for tower in Hebrew, and the shape of the Tower of Babel is probably a ziggurat. So most likely this was essentially a ziggurat. Now, why is that? So what this is going to be is this is going to be a tower to the heavens, but unlike some kind of depictions which just sort of have a very vertical tower going straight up, there were two purposes to this tower. One was that it would be a stairway to heaven, or a tower to heaven. Remember, Babylonian Empire, Tower of Babel, very much linked. These things have direct connections to each other, and all of this plays directly into Revelation understanding of Babylon. Okay, so this is sort of where it all comes from, is this Tower of Babel. It's kind of the seed of this. And they were trying to make a tower to heaven, in other words, to ascend to godhood or divinity themselves. But it's more than that, too. The Tower of Babel is built like a ziggurat, which essentially means that what you do is you build one level, okay, or one floor. Then you'd essentially build around that floor, still extending the floor out, and then on top of it as well. So now think of it like a step. I've got floor one, and then I can kind of step up to the second floor. If you're familiar with the Temple of Djoser, and I can pull up a brief picture, snapshot of that, the Temple of Djoser. Pyramid. You'll kind of get a feel for a ziggurat. It's essentially the step pyramid. Yeah, I probably will show you a picture, but it's like a step pyramid. Okay, and that is the Pyramid of Djoser, Djoser. And that's sort of like a ziggurat, but you can also look for other pictures of ziggurats. And the purpose, again, for the ziggurat was for the deity's access and the mankind's access to the heavenly realm of the gods. But it also was a place where all of the administration, all of the culture, essentially was a hub for society. So it was a reason to keep people centered. It was a reason to keep people together. In other words, people, unlike what God had commanded to go and populate the earth, people were sticking together in these cities, and they weren't going out and populating the earth. They were essentially just congregating together and becoming fully self-sufficient, standing in opposition to God as their own gods. And so that's what we're seeing here with the Tower of Babel. It was most likely a ziggurat that had grown to gargantuan proportions, possibly one of the largest ziggurats ever known to man, probably larger than the pyramids. So we're talking a gigantic ziggurat, and interestingly enough, we actually have here's a good picture of a ziggurat right here. I'll go ahead and throw this up there for us. Okay, there's a picture of a ziggurat here. You can see the ziggurat in the center. That's how they built it. And then secondarily, I'll go ahead and throw another picture up, which is actually a picture of a ziggurat, actually the Tower of Babel. Now, the thing is, it's much later in time, but it's a picture of the Tower of Babel with Nebuchadnezzar II. And there's going to be yellow lines drawn over because a lot of it's faded, but you'll be able to sort of see it here with the yellow lines. And that's essentially a picture of the Tower of Babel. Again, ziggurat in its structure, Nebuchadnezzar and the Tower of Babel. And so that's really key in terms of understanding what's going on with this tower, why it's such a big deal, because it's an administrative complex, a cultural complex, as well as being built to the gods. So it's possible even that Nebuchadnezzar tried to rebuild the Tower of Babel. All right. And with that, I just want to go ahead and say one or two quick comments about unprovenanced or undocumented antiquities. So here's the final thing we're going to say tonight. So we got to cover Tower of Babel, we got to do some flood stuff, we got to do Nimrod, cool things. Here's the issue with archaeology. There's a lot of stuff out there. You always got to be careful about this, where people say, oh, I found this, but it's either unprovenanced or undocumented. That essentially means that it cannot be used for scholarly evidence. If it's unprovenanced, that means they don't know necessarily where they found it or who found it, or it wasn't documented, or it wasn't obtained legally. Something about the find is now called into question, and therefore you're never going to see an article or anything like that in the scholarly realm written on it. And so it's really important to basically find provenance things, or essentially and that's why when you're doing your digging, there's very strict things they have to go through, procedures they have to do in order to make that find provenanced and documented. In other words, which layer did it come from? Was it next to anything else? So these are all things that have to be documented properly. So there's always people trying to sell artifacts and things, unprovenanced, black market, unfortunately. And so that's essentially a little bit about that and why we can't use those things, because that could lead us to bad conclusions. If it's unprovenanced, we don't know where it came from, we don't know exactly what it was, we're just taking someone's word on it. That doesn't work. So we really need this to be done in the proper way. And then the second thing is with all of the disruption in the Middle East, especially the last like 5-6 years, there's been a massive amount of destruction of archaeology. So destruction of ancient cities, destruction of museums, destruction of archaeological dig sites. I mean, you name it, things have been destroyed left, right, and center, which is also very unfortunate. So there's been a lot of history lost to us in the last recent years. But my hope is that through these lectures, and we're probably just going to, just so everybody knows here who's listening, we're probably just going to carry through Genesis. I think so. We're going to probably do like maybe Genesis, maybe Exodus. Yeah, maybe Exodus. We'll probably have like a couple more of these, and then we'll move on, and we'll revisit this at a later date. Just don't want to do too much archaeology all at once, but I do think Genesis and Exodus probably is what we're going to do. And I hope you guys are really enjoying this. I hope it's a lot of fun. I'd like to go ahead now and I'm just going to do a double quick check here. There's no questions. So with that, I'm just going to say thank you guys so much for joining us here at Spirit of Truth Church, Spirit of Truth Outreach for this talk on biblical archaeology. I hope you had a wonderful time. Hope you get to see and hear some cool things. And I hope to see you again next time. Have a wonderful night.